And today's broadcast is brought to you by Eclectic Horseman Magazine. Stay tuned for Eclectic Conversations hosted by Emily Gitchie.
I'm here today with Van Hargis to talk about his book, The Horse is My Teacher. And I'm super excited because I've never had the chance to visit with you, Van, but I so enjoyed reading your book. And I think the thing that struck me the most about it is your narrative style really feels like I'm sitting across the table hearing you tell your life story as I'm reading it. So it's great to meet you and welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Miss Emily, and I followed Eclectic Horseman for quite some time, and as you well know, I mentioned some of those characters in my book. That a lot of the foundation of your magazine and your programs have involved many of my heroes and my mentors. I speak of a few in my book, and I really applaud you for keeping those folks and the memory of those folks and the respect of those folks alive. You know, those of us like myself have been in the horse industry almost since birth. I think sometimes we take for granted as to our development. But it was at one point in time that I realized who, for lack of a better word, our godfather of our modern day horsemanship that we most of us practice today really kind of goes back to the Dorrance brothers, and of course one of their biggest messengers, Mr. Ray Hunt. And I didn't get a chance to work with Bill Dorrance, but I'm so grateful for the opportunity that was presented to me to get up and spend a little bit of time with Tom Dorrance. And I met him first at at Mr. Jack Brainerd, who was another one of my biggest mentors, Mr. Jack Brainerd's facility. And bottom line is, I'm so grateful for those opportunities to have met and work with those people. But I'm also incredibly grateful in today's time that folks like yourself are making the efforts of keeping their memories and their messages alive through those of us who have been fortunate enough to work with them directly.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's been just such a blessing to be able to do that and to work and share with information from people who I respect and just have the utmost desire to share it with as many people as I can.
Absolutely.
So, thank you.
Well, one thing I love too about Eclectic Horseman, and I think it kind of goes back to the Tom and Bill Dorrance days of simplicity. I just had this lecture at the ranch just a few moments ago, right before I just left over there and rushed back over to the house and said, "Oh, guys, I got an interview to do." But the topic of that message was simplicity. And it's funny to me to hear people read so many weird things into things. You know, for example, one of the words that we hear a lot today is, "Oh, such and such is a horsemanship guru." And I've heard that said before of Mr. Tom. And Mr. Tom was always one of my heroes in his simplicity. Of course, his horsemanship knowledge, experience, and exercise of his horsemanship was just brilliant. But it almost offended me when I hear people call him a guru, because I don't think he would have appreciated that. He would have probably chuckled about it, you know?
Yeah.
But the point is the simplicity. Simplicity takes an incredible amount of discipline, doesn't it?
It does. It really
Because
does.
in order to be simple, we've got to really ignore all the distractions that pull us apart from the simplicity. And with all the other things that are going on today through technology and all these different mediums of reaching people, which are all great, it's great that we can all reach out. But oftentimes that complicates things away from the simplicity. And to be frank, that's one of the things I've always really liked about the message behind Eclectic Horseman. So again, I applaud you for what you're doing, because it takes tremendous discipline to keep sending out a very simple message simply. and I think that credits those people who worked really hard to try to uncomplicate horsemanship. Horsemanship is not that complicated. Training horses is not that difficult. It simply takes discipline to see things from another perspective than simply our own.
Mm-hmm.
So I applaud you, Miss Emily. Appreciate what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, For those of us who maybe don't know much about you or what you're doing, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing in the world right now. And then we
Sure.
can talk more about the book, but what are you doing in the horse world right now, Van?
Well, right now I'm focusing on honestly staying home. And if I can be really frank and real honest about staying home, it's not that we still don't go to the occasional horse expo and we don't travel to go to other clinics, but we just don't do them near like we did there during the heyday of the horse expos and the horse fairs and clinics going literally all over the place. Um, and to be honest, I'm kind of doing now what I wish I'd have done 20 years ago. And let me explain why. Um, I went through a moment in time that I knew that the horse industry was my calling, that I was doing what I was supposed to do in doing that. But I went about it in ways that I think in one side could be very respectful and the other side might not be respectful, depending on whose perspective you're hearing it from. But I worked pretty hard. I hit the road pretty hard. I was on the road about 42 to 45 weeks out of the year at a point in time, and here comes the point I was going to make, at a point in time where I had two young daughters that would have really loved to have more dad time at home. But there's part of me that was saying, I'm doing what a dad's supposed to do because I was humping it and we were making good money. And that money, of course, was going home to do what I thought was providing my girls with all the things that I thought little girls might need or want. And then I realized, you know what my girls really needed or wanted? Their dad home. And by the time I finally realized that, my girls were about grown. And I literally called some of my sponsors, and I'm going to tell you, I had some very, very understanding sponsors. And I'm not going to go into detail who they are, but I just don't think this is the time or the place to do, tags on certain people or certain companies. But I called them all and I said, look, if you guys want to drop me, I totally understand it. But I've got a daughter that's just a few months away from graduating high school. And I've only seen a handful of her soccer games, and I haven't been to enough of her school functions. I've got another daughter that's a sophomore in high school, and it's been pretty much the same. If you guys want to drop me, I totally get it, but I'm going to keep everything that we've got on our schedule now, but I'm not scheduling anything new because I'm going to go home and spend time with my girls. And that was probably one of the toughest decisions that I've ever made because I knew that would probably be the nail in the coffin of my business, because you know as well as anybody that this is an industry that people are coming and going all the time. And unless you've already reached that legacy status, pulling yourself out of the spotlight, people can forget you pretty quickly. But Miss Emily, to the credit of my sponsors, all but about three said, Van, we understand, you take as much time as you need.
Wow, that's incredible.
And that helped me tremendously because I still got my horses fed. I still got things done without me having to beat the roads up and go up and down the highway as much as I was traveling and going out of country as much as I was going out of country. It was really good to be home. And just like I predicted, getting out of the spotlight, people forgot pretty quickly, who's that Van Hargis guy? Or where'd he go? And everybody just assumed that I just went home and retired. And I kind of sort of did because after my girls got up and into college and went to doing their own little thing, and they didn't need dad around as much as they did before, by that time, I honestly didn't want to go back out on the road. And things had changed. The horse industry had changed. Mm-hmm. By this time, we're post 2007, 2008, 2009. If anybody's old enough to remember what happened at that time, it was a big, huge economy that crashed. And it had, at that point in time, it had a major effect on the horse industry. A lot of horse expos went out of business. Mm-hmm. A lot of them never came back. People didn't have the money to spend on their horses and their horse hobbies. Not that you're ever going to take horses away from horse people, but they're going to restrict a little bit of their travel and their excess spending that they were doing at a time where our economy was really good.
Mm-hmm.
And that affected things, but not to be selfish, but that affected me in a positive way. That gave me all the excuses that I needed to stay home. And then it got to the point, well, okay, well, how are you going to generate this much money? Because you're no longer competing like you once did. You're no longer going up, because when you're competing and you're winning, that's your advertisement.
Yeah. Yeah.
You didn't spend any money on advertising. You didn't have to, because being in the winning circle and being holding there, getting pictures taken with the trophies in your hands was all the advertisement that you needed. But I wasn't competing anymore, because I had to make another decision years ago, which was, do you want to compete or you want to go spread the message? Because mm-hmm. you can't do both successfully. Mm-hmm. You kind of have to choose to do one or the other. Not that you can't do one and do the other, but if you're going to be as good as you want to be at one, you got to pick one. You can't have you can't be straddling the line, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So I'd made that decision years ago to get out of the competitive side and hit the road and start doing the clinics and the seminars and the expos. And of course, that took me out of the competition arena. So the question was, now that I chose to be home, am I going to go back to the competition arena? Or what are we going to do differently? And that's when it hit me to do the Horsemanship Academy. Mm-hmm. I had already had students asking, hey, can I come and work as an intern? Can I come and go and be an apprentice or do whatever? The difference is that we were putting a tremendous amount of time and effort in my students. I put a lot of time in the students, just like I put a lot of time in the horses. And believe me, Miss Emily, I have crazy high expectations for both. I want my horses to be as perfect as I know how to get them. And I expect my students to be as perfect as I know how to get them, with the humility of realizing that perfection is impossible. But it's a darn good goal to shoot for, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
But what I didn't know is if I was going to put that much time into my students, were they going to be willing to pay for that time? Because before, we would let the students come there and, quite frankly, we'd just work their butts off. We'd ride a lot of horses. We'd go do a lot of day work, and we got a lot done with our students. If nothing else, they learned work ethic. The question was, are they willing to pay for that same experience? And the good Lord blessed me, because as we kind of let that message get out that we were bringing students to our facility to learn, and that was their number one goal. And Ms. Emily, if you don't mind, I'm going to touch on something else just briefly. What got me to do the academy just as much as anything is when you go to places like your horse expos and your whatever, your other trainers will all get together and we'll visit. Mm-hmm. The thing that was hurting the most of us is that we couldn't keep good apprentices. We couldn't keep good interns. We couldn't keep good assistants. Right about the time you had invested a tremendous amount of time in one, hoping they would stay with your program, they'd go hang their own shingle or they'd leave. And you'd start all over again. Mm-hmm. And you go through all the frustrations and all the cussing and all the dirt kicking of getting those students to a point where they could maybe be an asset for your program, and they'd leave again. Mm-hmm. So me and the other trainers were having these discussions. As man, we're all going through the same thing. And I said, well, maybe we need to have a school on how to train these people to be better assistants. And everybody kind of looked at me and said, well, heck, you're the teacher. Why don't you do it? You speak better than I do, Van. Why don't you do it? And I thought, okay.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'm doing it anyway, so why not do it, but under the guise, if you want to call it, of an academy, a horsemanship school. Mm-hmm. And we started it, and the Lord just blessed me. People started coming.
Yeah. And so are a lot of your students that come, are they then looking towards doing the horsemanship program and then knowing that they're going to go on and work for other trainers or do business out on their own?
Absolutely. We have a placement program because we always have other trainers contact me. Van, I need somebody. Do you know of anybody? Mm-hmm. Do you know of anybody in your area that we could use? And the one thing that I do know, that a student that makes it through my program, they're going to have thick skin, because I'm not easy on them. I say what needs to be said. I'm going to work them. The only thing I'm not going to do is put them at risk, because I'm not a risk taker when it comes to horses bucking or storms and things like that with our horses. We just don't put them in those situations.
Mm-hmm.
But I will darn sure test their resolve.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time one of them gets through the program, I've got an extremely amount of good confidence in them to say, this is a student for you. This kid's got good work ethic, or this kid's got great talent, but might need your persuasion to help them with their work ethic a little bit. In other words, I'll know enough about them to give them a really good reference.
Mm-hmm.
It's weird though. I don't know if this is good or bad, but the ones that don't do quite as well in my program have a tendency to want to go out and hang their own shingle, and that scares me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The ones that are smart will take the opportunity to go work for other trainers and learn more and continue to learn. Because we all know that if you've been in this industry long enough, you're never going to learn what you want to learn. You know, I speak fondly of Jack Brainerd a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to touch on what he taught me a long time ago. I was introduced to Jack when I was a little kid, before I was even old enough to be in 4-H. But I met him at a 4-H event. And I talk about this in my book, about how I met him and how it worked out. But I've known Jack since I was 8 years old. Didn't know him until years later. And the more I knew about him, the more I respected who he was as a teacher and who he was as a horseman and what he's done for our industry. And one day I was asked by the Stock Horse of Texas if I would do a clinic for them in Abilene, Texas. I said, of course I would. Then they asked me if I minded sharing my clinician time with another clinician. Sure, who is it? Jack Brainerd. Are you kidding me? I get to work with Jack Brainerd on the same level? I get to share time with Mr. Jack Brainerd? You don't mind? Of course not. I would love to. Well, during the middle of the clinic, we happen to be sitting in the arena, and I'm facing one direction, and I'm working with my group, and Jack's right beside me on his horse, and he's coaching the opposite end of the arena, but we're side by side in the middle of the arena facing different directions. And I yell something out at some lady, which is not unusual for me to yell at somebody, but I yelled out at something, and out of the corner of my eye, I see Jack Brainerd shaking his head. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking, oops, I must have said something wrong. So I didn't want Jack to scold me in front of God and everybody. So I said, Jack, can you turn your microphone off? So he reaches over and he turns his microphone off. And he said, what's the matter? And I said, well, I'm just curious. What did I say that was wrong? He goes, nothing. Why? He goes, well, I was noticing you were shaking your head. No, man, I was just thinking, I'm going to die before I learn everything about these darn horses that I want to learn. Miss Emily, he was 86.
Yeah, yeah.
At that point in time, he had probably trained more trainers than most of us trainers have trained horses. And he was still picking up on little bitty tidbits. I didn't say anything new. I just said it different. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he picked up on that, and he thought that was a good way to say something. And that night at supper, we talked about that more. The greatest horsemen that I know then and now are horsemen that are still hungry to learn. And that's why I encourage my students, no matter what level they graduate from my program, never stop learning. Mm-hmm. Leave here and be humble enough to know you don't know anything.
Yeah.
And then move forward and go to work with another trainer and learn as much from that person as you can possibly learn. And then go learn from another trainer, and so on and so on and so on. And then maybe you'll be as wise as Jack Brainerd and be sitting there when you're 86 years old and think to yourself, I'm going to die before I learn anything about these darn horses that I want to learn. That was great wisdom from Mr. Brainerd, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's a marvel to me. We have some subscribers who are in their 90s. They're no longer riding, but they're still buying books and studying, and they have just a keen desire to learn all they can. And I just, what's your thoughts? Do you think it's just like an inborn mindset? Do you think that people, like, what separates those people, those students that you have that have that desire from those that don't? Or do you see shifts over time in folks when they come? What's your thoughts on that?
My thought is this, and it's pretty dang simple, which if you hadn't guessed by now, I love things simple. It's humility. When we are humble enough to know that we know nothing, and that one more day of learning something is one better day than what we had. And how many more days do we have? We have no idea. So we need to press forward and continue to be humble enough to keep learning. Never assume for a moment that we know all that we need to know, because we don't. And the lack of that would be the lack of humility. Now, humility, we can be blessed with humility extremely young ages.
Mm-hmm.
And those people are, wise for their age. Some of us don't. Some of us, like me, I didn't even start thinking about that sort of thing until years later. So I applaud those people who are much older in their life and they're still humble enough and still hungry enough to want to learn one more day's lesson. And the other thing that I think of, and I say this all the time, and the older I get, the more I say it, horsemanship is an opportunity to practice humanship. We can all get along without horses. We don't need them. But they're darn sure a blessing for us to learn everything about ourselves that we really want to learn. We just use the horse. In my case, I just use the horse as my living, breathing whiteboard to figure out what it is that I want to make better within myself. Do I want to listen better? Do I want to be a better communicator? Do I need to be more assertive? Do I need to be more passive? I don't know. And we don't know until that specific moment hits us. Now, simply want to share something else with you about an experience I had up at Tom Dorrance's place years ago. And again, applaud Jack Brainerd, because Jack set this whole thing up after Tom had done his clinic at Jack's place there in the Aubrey Pilot Point area years and years ago. So Jack arranged this for me, and I get the opportunity to go visit with Mr. Dorrance. And the more I was around Mr. Dorrance, the more frustrated I got, because he reminded me more and more of my grandfather, who never answered a question. You could ask him a question, unless it was just point blank yes or no, you wouldn't get an answer. Or if you did get an answer, you get one like this. This is my typical Tom Dorrance response. Well, it depends. And I was working several horses while I was there, and I would ask him questions, and he would say, well, it depends. Another question. Well, I don't know, Van. I'm thinking to myself, if you don't know, then who the heck knows? Who knows? You're the smartest horseman that anybody will give credit for, and yet you keep telling me you don't know. And I was getting frustrated. Well, one day we were sitting at his table, and we go to this I don't know thing again, and it depends thing again. And I get frustrated enough that I hit my fist on the table. I said, Mr. Dorrance, why don't you just answer my questions? Why are you like my grandfather and everything seems evasive? And he grins in his wisdom and he says, because by the time you ask the question, the moment is over. Horses live in the moment. So I can only tell you what I might do or what I could have done. I don't know what I would do because I'm no longer in that moment. That's wisdom. Now, that sounds kind of like a guru, but that's the simplicity of Mr. Dorrance and the honesty and the truthfulness, you see. Some other schmuck out there is going to tell, well, if that had been me, I'd have done this, or you should have done that. You don't know that because you weren't in the moment. Mm-hmm. That's incredibly humbling to realize that we are literally flying by the seat of our pants every stride we take with a horse. Because we, just like that horse, if we want to be successful with that horse, we have to be in that moment. But in that moment, are we the leader or are we the follower? Sometimes it's okay to be the follower, but sometimes we got to step up and be the leader because the horse is depending on that. Because if we're involved, the horse is no longer in its element, are they?
No, yeah.
So Mr. Dorrance's wisdom was incredible. Now, it took me a few years to realize it. And now I realize I'm frustrating the hell out of my students by saying the same thing. Well, I don't know. Well, it depends. So I have Mr. Dorrance and Mr. Brainerd to thank for that lesson of humility.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's fantastic. Well, let's tell us a little bit about you. Before we turned the recorder on, you were telling me a little bit about how you were encouraged to write the book, or how that seed was planted. So tell us a little bit about that. How, since writing a book maybe wasn't the thing that you thought you were going to do, how did that come about?
Well, it's very interesting. Miss Emily, I was sharing with you before, I was just a typical young trainer riding horses and training horses there at the house. And I always have encouraged my clients to come and watch and learn what we're doing, because one of my biggest complaints about horse trainers is, or people with or horse training clients, is we spend all that time training the horse. And if the owner doesn't learn what we're doing, then we're basically setting the horse up for failure. So I was always encouraging my clients to come and watch and participate and be a part of the process, if at all possible. So one day I'm out there riding one of the horses, and my clients were there. They were watching, and they would ask a few questions. And my typical way of teaching people is through stories or through analogies. So I'm sharing stories and sharing analogies as I'm working with their horse. And they're just over there just nodding their head like they're grasping it. They're getting what it is that I'm communicating. And then finally, one of the clients speaks up and says, Van, if anybody ought to write a book, you should. We love your experiences, stuff you tell about when you're a kid and how that was relative to what you do when you're in a horse, and the times that you shared with your grandfather and blah, 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 blah. So you ought to write a book. And I just died laughing, because I know enough about me and know enough about to write a book. It takes somebody sitting down long enough to get that done. Unless you hire somebody to do it for you, you've got to sit down long enough to get that done. And the other thing was, I wasn't the greatest of students. I wasn't a bad student, but I wasn't the greatest of students in school. I mean, I was an A student, but I wasn't an A student. In other words, I didn't work for A. It just happened to come around. So I just couldn't see myself having the knowledge or the discipline to be able to do that. But it planted a seed in my mind. And it wasn't really until my mom got sick that my mom would always tell me what moms typically tell them. Well, Van, you ought to write that. You ought to write that down. You ought to do this. And Miss Emily, I don't mind telling anybody, I have been and always was a mama's boy. I was always working hard to make my mama proud and to do things for my mother. Maybe that's just the ranch heritage and the ranch culture. I don't know, but that's darn sure the way it was at our place. Make mama happy. Well, she would frequently say that. Well, Van, you need to write a book. When my mom got sick, I thought about that a lot. And I called a prospective publisher and said, I've got this idea. And I want to write a book giving credit to all of my mentors, all of my school teachers, my mama, my grandparents. I want them to know what little bit I know is nothing to do with me, but a whole heck of a lot to do with my support team from this time that I was a little kid. And that was honestly why I also dedicated the book to my mother, because mother inspired me to do it, and her sickness inspired me to get off my butt and get it done now. And when I called that publisher, I said, look, we might be on an unrealistic timeline, but I'll do my part if you guys promise to do your part and get this book out before my mama dies. We already knew that my mother only had a short time to get through this. And if I get emotional, I apologize. But
yeah, no.
We knew we had to get on it and get it done. And we got it done.
Yeah.
So that's why the timeline is as what it was, and that was why the book was dedicated to my mother. Yeah. Is because of, if it wouldn't have been for her and her inspiration and her hard work all those years of being a good leader and probably being one of the strongest people that I've ever known, and it wouldn't have been for her just planting that seed in my mind about share your message, share your stories, I probably would have never done it. So thanks to my mother for continuing to plant those seeds. And then maybe, who knows, but maybe as God would have it, he knew that probably that if there wasn't some sort of urgency to it, I might have continued to procrastinate. So mother's illness might have been the fire under my butt. In fact, that's
Yeah.
not might to it. There's no doubt that it was.
Yeah.
But that's how the book came about. Was the seed was planted by my clients, and the urgency by my mother.
Yeah. And was she able to see the book come to completion?
Absolutely amazing. The publishing company did a great job for me in the sense that they produced kind of what they call like their first copy
Mm-hmm.
of the book. It's basically for me. They actually printed a couple of copies for both me and my mom, just in case my mom didn't make it until the book was in its final print. And I presented that first copy to my mother. And again, I may get a bit emotional, but you would have thought that I just gave my mother the greatest gift in the entire world, because
Wow.
she just, oh my God, because she didn't know that I was working on it.
She didn't.
She
Wow.
knew that I was making notes of it and stuff like that. But I've been doing that for decades. So
Yeah.
she didn't know that I was really humping it to try to get this done. So I presented her with that editor's copy, I think is what they call it. I presented
Mm-hmm.
her with the editor's copy. My mother read it start to finish in one night. And it wasn't but just a few months later that the final copy came out. And of course, I wrote an inscription in there for my mother and presented that to her. And as if it was new again, she read that one start to finish in one
Yeah.
night.
Yeah. Oh,
I think mamas just do that, right? They're going to
they
support their
do.
kids.
Yes, they do.
But
They do. Well,
but
that,
that's
and I'm happy to give a shout out to the folks over at Trafalgar. I mean, they've been doing incredible work in the horse industry for years and years. So I'm like, that story just really is touching, and I'm so glad that she got to share that with you.
yes, ma'am. I couldn't be happier, and couldn't be happier with Trafalgar for making the things happen the way they did, because they did push things a little bit for me. And make things happen as quickly as they needed to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, and it's a remarkable the the way that you go about sharing your experiences and the lessons. I mean, it really is unique because it is your stories, and the lessons flow out of those anecdotes. I mean, it's not a how-to book, but you
No.
learn so much through reading it.
And and with all due respect to all the folks out there that spend tremendous amount of time writing how-to books, more power to them, because I can't figure that out. I mean, I've been training horses. Not that I knew what I was doing when I was 12 years old, but I started riding horses and accepting money for it when I was 12 years old. And even that was an accident. In my opinion, it was an accident at the time. I just happened to be riding a lot of horses, going up down the highway, just riding them everywhere. And it's a 12-year-old kid's going to do. And one of my neighbors just happened to see it and say, "Hey, Van, by the way, what are you doing this summer?" And then she offered me an opportunity to ride her horse for her. And but even with starting at 12, and I'm 61 now, that's a lot of years of riding horses, and I still don't have it figured out. So for me to be able to sit down and try to write a how-to book, I couldn't begin to do it. So my hat's off to all those who can, because I couldn't imagine trying to do it. And part of it goes back to what Mr. Dorrance would tell me. So I don't know, Van, because it happens right now. So by the time that took me to sit down and write it, it darn sure that moment would be over. But I hope that the people who read those how-to type books, though, do have the knowledge and the wisdom to realize that those are just ideas of what you might do. To credit Mr. Dorrance, this is what you might do. This might get you started on how to get something going. But if I ever learned anything in this business, and to steal a quote from Mr. Dorrance, well, Van, the only absolute that there are none. And that's pretty darn true when it comes to living, breathing animals.
Mm-hmm.
The only absolute is there are none. But I've been asked several times, Miss Emily, to write a few how-to type situations, and I try like heck to stay away from it.
Yeah.
But since we mentioned Trafalgar, they've done a really good job of making a platform and having a platform for a lot of those types of books. And I only pray that they really help a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I see it. I mean, it's a constant balancing act where you have folks who, you have to have some kind of idea of what to do in order
Yes, ma'am.
to get enough feedback safely to know that it's what you should have done or shouldn't have done. So there's,
Yeah.
that there's a place for it, but we also have to know that it's not like, it depends, and
Yeah.
but we got to start somewhere and have something to go do. So,
You
but
betcha.
yeah. I wanted to talk about, hang on, I wrote down what I wanted to talk about. The chapter that really like resonated with me when I was reading through it was the Dare to Let Your Horse Do Good
Yes, ma'am.
chapter, where you talk about letting go. And that is something that I have struggled with my entire riding career. And I really think you do an amazing job talking about that idea of letting your horse go.
You bet.
Yeah.
Well, that again was one of those accidental moments. One of those, some people say coincidence. I just call them God incidences. But, somebody asked me one time, so, what's one of the one things that you would recommend you do with your horses? Just let them go, dare them to be good. So many times a dare leads to something negative, doesn't it? And to me, why not just do your due diligence to set your horse up to do something successful and then let them go to see if they do it. If they do, great. If they don't, great. Because both of those is good information. If they do something good, then continue to let them go. Don't get in their way. Don't change their mind. But if they didn't do something good, what was it that wasn't good? Because the information is good. But let's say that you wanted to go straight and they turn left. That's good information. I would rather you have gone straight, but since you went left, let's go to the right. I mean, you see where I'm going with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Either way, the information is really good, but the only way you're going to get that information is to have the guts enough to let go.
Right. Well,
Now,
and so many of us are afraid of making mistakes ourselves. And so you have to, before you can let your horse make a mistake, you have to be okay with you making a mistake.
sure. What happened to one of my students yesterday? For whatever reason, she's having a hard time feeling when a horse is about to pick up a correct lead or incorrect lead. Anybody that spent much time in the saddle, you will feel one or the other. You'll feel that shift of balance to where before they ever pick up the correct lead that they're about to pick up the correct lead, or that they're not set up to pick up the left lead. They're about to pick up the right lead, and yet I want the left lead. So we have to learn to feel that, and we have to also learn enough to set it up so that it will happen. Well, yesterday, for example, unfortunately, she's gotten so used to being wrong that when the horse went to pick up the correct lead, I didn't think anything above it, but I just happened to be looking at the same time that this moment was in this transition. And I said, good job. And she had already started the correction process.
Oh. Yeah.
And then as soon as she heard me yell, good job, then she knew then that her horse must be on the correct lead, and she let it go. She corrected herself, you see. There's nothing wrong with that. I told her, that's good. Who cares?
Yeah.
The horse didn't know that you screwed up. The important thing is you did, and you were humble enough to accept your mistake and just go on. Instead of making yourself right by trying to prove the horse was wrong, when yet I clearly saw that the horse was about to be correct. You see, and I applauded her yesterday, not on just being correct on the correct lead. I applauded her on the humility of accepting the fact that she was wrong, which yielded correctness. Now, that sounded like a whole bunch of word jumble there, but the reality is it took her learning a lesson about herself to be okay with being wrong about being wrong. You see?
Yeah.
And therefore, the horse had the freedom then to continue to be correct. Now, that all goes back to exactly what you were saying before. I dare you to be good. I dare you to be good. Set them up, do your dead level best, ask, follow through, and then dare you to be good. And if they're good, let them go even more. Let them enjoy the moment. Let them enjoy being correct.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the biggest things I see today is when people are working horses in the round pen, which is one of my biggest pet peeves, is round pen work. Most people have no idea what they're doing. And they don't allow the horse to be correct. Being right or being wrong can both be addictive. But if you had a choice, which would you be addicted to? Rather be addicted to being correct or being addicted to being wrong? Because you're going to accept either one.
Mm-hmm.
But what the problem with being wrong all the time is, it does absolutely nothing about the development of your confidence.
Mm-hmm.
If no matter what you do, you're wrong, then you're not going to have confidence in anything that you do.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, when you get a horse to do something, set them up in such a way that they don't have any other choice but to be correct. For
Mm-hmm.
example, if I want the horse to go to the left in the round pen, I'm not going to do it from the middle. I'm going to go to the far right side of the round pen so that the only place this horse can go is left. And I'm going to love him and reward him as if he just won the world championship. We're going the only choice he had to make. Now, how do you think that's going to help the horse's confidence?
Immensely.
And then I'm going to
Yeah.
set him up again. And I'm going to set him up again. Now, each time I set him up, I'm going to be more refined, meaning I'm not going to make it quite as obvious, but the horse is going to get successful. And I want this horse to get addicted to success and not addicted to failure.
Mm-hmm.
But if he is wrong, I'm not going to beat him up for it. I'm just going to go back to Tom. A lot of people don't know this, but Tom Dorrance came up with the quote, make the right thing easy and the wrong thing difficult. Ray Hunt popularized it.
Mm-hmm.
Ray Hunt went on the road with that message. But if the horse does make the wrong decision, just make that decision more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Either mentally stressful, physically stressful. Let them absorb that being stressed and then give them a chance to be correct again. And it's their choice from that moment on.
Mm-hmm.
Which horse would you rather be, the stressed horse or the relaxed horse? My job is just to set you up to be the relaxed horse. I can't make you take that option, but I can darn sure do my dead level best to set you up for it.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm confident that I've done everything that I know to do to set you up for it, then I also need to be confident enough that you're going to maybe take me up on it. But the only way I can do it is to dare you to be good. I got to let you go. And as long as you're good, I'm going to leave you alone. Your job is to train me to leave you alone.
Yeah.
That's your job. When you're not correct, my commitment to you is to help you be correct.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what you don't know between correct or incorrect, correct is easier. You just don't know that.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's not a horse alive that wants to lope because we ask them to. That's way too hard of work. They'd rather be standing under a shade tree somewhere, someplace eating grass or procreating. Who knows? But they darn sure don't want to work and exercise under saddle carrying around a horseman if they had their choice. We could all delusion ourselves all day long and say, oh, my horse just loves his job. No, he don't. He would rather be left alone. But if he is going to lope, and if we're going to be the ones that ask him to, then we owe it to him to help him lope correct, on the correct lead, the correct balance, the correct direction. But how can we help incentivize him to understand how good correct is? To use one of my own analogies, let him dig a ditch with a dull shovel. And then let him dig a ditch with a sharp one. Either way, he's still digging a ditch. But given a choice later in life, he's going to start choosing that sharp shovel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If the horse insists on being on the incorrect lead, I'm not going to argue with him. I'm not big enough, strong enough to change it. But I can let his idea not seem so brilliant and let my idea seem better. Over time, my idea becomes his idea, which now becomes our idea, and we get accomplished what we want to get accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
He gets the job over quicker and easier, and I got what I wanted. Everybody wins.
Mm-hmm.
That's communication and teamwork, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But sometimes we got to let them figure out that hard thing is just hard. Let me help you find an easier way to do what I'm asking you to do. And it's no different than asking a kid to go out and mow the yard with a lawnmower or sheep shears. Either
Yeah.
one, he's going to mow the yard. But I bet you that kid would rather do it with a lawnmower.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But that's my little humble philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. So this might be a little bit off topic, but in hearing you visit about these ideas, and you've got young people coming in all the time, do you feel like there's a base knowledge where these ideas at a certain time would be revolutionary? Do you feel like there's a groundswell of just basic knowledge where people understand that concept more, or do you still feel like you're sharing something that's foreign to most horse people?
Because of the age that we live in, we're surrounded by information. In my day, it was books and magazines or conversations. I learned a lot what I learned from other ranch folk.
Mm-hmm.
We'd go do ranch work, and if you're in that business, you can't help but to look at the guy that's the most efficient fellow there. The most efficient fellow there is probably riding the best horse and has the most amount of knowledge. Therefore, he's efficient at what he does. He just makes a hard job look easy. In today's world, there's an influx of information from everywhere. You can go to YouTube, you can go to Facebook, you can, there's billions of ways, not literally billions, but there's hundreds of ways for people to learn stuff today. I'm inundated with students who have a lot of information. They have absolutely no idea how to apply it.
Mm-hmm.
Even with my own quotes, I teach by my quotes, and some of the quotes that I use are quotes of other trainers. And believe me, I'm one of those guys that I give credit where credit's due almost every time I say one of those quotes. But if I say one of those quotes to one of my students, then I expect my student to be able to repeat it back to me. And then I'm going to ask the tough question: where's the application?
Mm-hmm.
Demonstrate that for me. I don't give a flying flip if you can quote me, Tom Dorrance, Ray Hunt, Jack Brainerd. I don't care if you can quote us. That means nothing to me. It means nothing to your horse. Your horse has never heard of these people. What this horse cares about is that you know how to apply that little tidbit of information that's captured in those very few words of just a quote.
Mm-hmm.
Can you apply that? I can't begin to tell you, Miss Emily, how many times I've heard people make the right thing easy and the wrong thing difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds so simple, but I've seen people screw it up to the point to where I feel incredibly sorry for some of the horses that they deal with. Yet they've got the knowledge, the idea, they just don't understand the concept.
Mm-hmm.
My goal is, and to steal another thing from Tom Dorrance years ago, is to help translate.
Mm-hmm.
Help translate what this horse is trying to communicate to us through that quote to the ultimate application to finally the result that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So what I find in our students is a tremendous amount of book knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
but the inability to exercise it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care if you're a doctor, if you're a lawyer, anybody that's already a doctor or a lawyer will tell you the lesson starts when you get out of the books.
Yeah.
the practical world will teach you a whole heck of a lot more about your choice of discipline than what that book will ever teach you. And to credit my university where I graduated and two of my instructors, both of my best instructors when I was in college were people who had retired from the practical world and chose to go back to education.
Mm-hmm.
One of which was a vice president of marketing for Westinghouse.
Mm-hmm.
The other was vice president of marketing for Neiman Marcus. And if you've ever been in Texas, you know about Neiman Marcus. I learned more from those people because they only used the books as outlines of ideas and concepts.
Mm-hmm.
What they tried to share with us was their lessons of what really happens in the practical world. And they were more real to me because they had the experience to go with the concepts. And quite frankly, they would tell you some of those concepts were just baloney.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds good on paper, but it doesn't work in the real world. And if you shine enough saddles with your butt, you realize that there's a lot of horsemen out there giving those types of things too.
Mm-hmm.
That some of that advice may sound good on paper, and it may sound good when you're in front of an audience out there working with one horse that you've been riding for the last 10 years. But does it work on the application in general to affect a change, a positive change in the lives of other horses and other people? In other words, can it really be practiced
Mm-hmm.
for the masses and not for that single success? That's why I absolutely hate gimmicks,
Mm-hmm.
just for that reason. I just don't like gimmicks. You know, speaking of gimmicks, I don't want anybody to tie what I'm about to say to the word gimmick. For the last 22 years, one of my sponsors has been a bit manufacturer. Rainsman Bits has been one of my sponsors for 22 years now. And I don't know why. Because I flat out tell people I'm not a bit person. I've got nothing against them. They're just a tool to me. But I do like Rainsman because, number one, they're American. Number two, they were humble enough to listen to me and my ideas and listen and appreciate the simplicity of my ideas. And they also respected the fact that I don't agree with all the bits that they make. In fact, I told them numerous times, there's a lot of them out there, wish I would just kind of bunch them all together and start selling boat anchors. But the reality is, bits are a tool that we can use to help communicate with our horses. But what I liked about Rainsman is that they would listen to me when I would say that the most important thing that you could have when working with a bit is the knowledge of how it affects a horse and how to use it.
Mm-hmm.
That bit, that gimmicky tool, is only as good or only as bad as the knowledge and the hands using it. And that goes for everything that we use in our horse industry.
Mm-hmm.
The saddles, our bits, the gimmicky little tools that people want to use. I'm not opposed to them. There's a lot of them out there I wish that didn't exist. But I've got nothing against those inanimate objects. What I'm all about, though, is just knowing what it does and how it affects your horse, and you hopefully having the knowledge to use it. Because I guess anything could be a gimmick, couldn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In some people's eyes, one of my clients right now, she likes to ride all of her horses with I don't even know what you'd call it. I don't know if you'd call it a side pull, but whatever it is, she wants to be bitless.
Mm-hmm.
I get that. I respect that. But I also told her that it sure means your hands are going to have to be darn good. Your knowledge and experience to be able to read your horse before a moment of need comes up is going to put a lot of burden on you. And she's willing to work at that and work on her skills.
Mm-hmm.
And the more she learns about herself, the more she learns about her horse. It wouldn't make any difference if it was a hay string or the most expensive bit in the business. She's still probably going to have some successes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Cool. Do you have a segment of your, I love to have authors read their books. It's sort of a thing that I like to do on this thing that we do. Is there a section from your book that you'd like to share with us today?
Miss Emily, when you shared that with me, that you thought you might want me to do such, I thought to myself, gee, what am I going to do? And I mentioned my mother earlier, and but the part that I kind of wanted to share was in chapter 4 of my book. It's the title chapter is, or the chapter that, or the title of that chapter is, "Everything Comes to He Who Waits." But the dot 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 of that is, as long as he who waits works like hell while he waits. And that to me is, number one, just a really great life lesson. Because I don't know of anybody that ever fell to the top at anything. In order to achieve anything in this world, you've got to have some sort of work ethic. And if anybody's ever trained horses, you know that it's a ongoing, never-ending process. You're never done. You're never done with a horse. You're never done with yourself. And for that reason, I despise the phrase and the term a finished horse. So that's a finished head horse. So that's a finished cutter. That's a finished barrel racer. That's a finished ranch horse. And not to sound too crude and cruel, but to me, if he's finished and cut his head off, let's dig the hole. Let's get, send him to heaven. If he's that finished, he's done. There's never a horse that can't get better, and there's never a horseman that can't get better. So to me, the chapter that I'm referring to there on page 31 of my book is about work ethic. Everything comes to he who waits, so long as he who waits works like heck while he waits. Knowing and appreciating how long a process takes, and to steal another quote from Tom Dorrance, take the time it takes. And be patient enough to wait. But while you're waiting, doesn't mean you're sitting on your butt doing nothing. While you're waiting, you're working. You're working toward the outcome that you want. And I'm going to just touch on where the origin of this quote, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
It tells a little bit about our work ethic. When I was young, no different than a lot of kids my age, there was no choice but to work at the ranch. We had stuff that had to get done, and every living body that was capable of doing something did something. And we happened to have a ranch that we were in partners with my stepfather's aunt. She had the land and half the cattle, and we had the other half of the cattle, and we had all the labor. Mm-hmm. We did the work, and our work was for our half of the rent, I guess you could say, on the land. Mm-hmm. And every quarter or so, we'd have a business meeting at her place. And at that business meeting, we would discuss which cows needed to be culled and which ones we were going to keep and how much land we was going to put in winter grass and so on and so forth. And I was always listening to that. And I know this is going to sound ridiculous to most kids today, but at that time I was only about 8 or 9 years old. But I listened. Why? Because when wintertime come and the days were short, I was the one having to go out and do the feeding. And our old 55 model hay truck, I'd go out there and feed cattle. So I was listening because I want to know how many cows I'm going to have to feed this winter. I want to know if we're going to have enough wheat grass or which winter pasture, so I know how much feed I was going to have to put out. So I had a vested interest in this business because I was part of the labor. My mama had a job to do. My stepdad had a job to do. And I had a job to do. And that job was feeding the cattle. Mm-hmm. Well, there was a moment where the adults were just visiting. They weren't really talking business. So I, like a typical young kid, would get up and wander around. And I'd wander around in Aunt Faye's house. And she was an old school teacher. And she always had lots of really cool stuff in her office. And I just happened to be looking around on a shelf. And the first thing that caught my eye, if I have to admit, was the word hell. Because as a little kid, you just don't cuss a lot. And all of a sudden, here's a cuss word right there for God and everybody to read. And I was reading it. So that intrigued me, and I looked a little closer, and I could read what it said. And it said, and it shows this old cowboy leaning against a fence post, an old dilapidated, down in our part of the country, we'd call it an old board art fence post. And he's just leaning against that fence post, and he had his hat all cocked up. You could tell he'd been sweating and labored. Half his shirt was untucked. The other shirt was part of it was tucked in. And you could just tell he was tired and labored. And he looks and he just sees miles and miles and miles of fence still to go. And this little bubble above his head, and it says, everything comes to he who waits. Because in that vision that he was having was a completed fence row. As long as he who waits works like hell while he waits. So while you're waiting, get to busy on building that fence, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's indicative. If anybody that's ever done any ranch work, you know that ranch work involves building fence and feeding cows and all that goes with it. So that quote always meant a lot to me because, number one, I thought it was funny how I learned to read it. And who knows why, at 8 or 9 years old, why a quote like that would stick in my mind. I mean, because there's lots of other experiences and lots of other things I've read from the time that at that age until much, much later that I sat down to write this book. But that quote stuck with me all those years. I don't know why, but maybe God does, you know. Mm-hmm. So that's always been one of the key components of my book that I thought that I enjoyed the most, because writing that chapter brought back good memories to me. Mm-hmm. I think it made me think of my mama a lot, because she's a lady who had a lot of patience and obviously to put up with me all those years. But the other side of it was my mother never shied away from work. And I could not be more grateful for that at the ripe old age of 61, to have learned, if nothing else in my lifetime, that work yields really good results. It builds a lot more than an income. It builds something a whole heck of a lot more important than income, in my humble opinion. Mm-hmm. It sure builds a character in a person. Mm-hmm. So that chapter has always meant a lot to me. Everything comes to he who waits, so long as he who waits works like hell while he waits. So thank you, Faye Cooper, for having that in your office. And thank you for my mama and everybody else around me that showed me the examples of what that quote really meant. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that, Van.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I can just see a little you in an office. Like how you described it, I can just totally see that moment. And having had a little one of my own who's now 16, I can imagine the impact that something like that would have. It's funny what sticks in your head. So,
well, you know what's funny is that my grandmother, another hard working woman, another ranch woman, they dabbled in two really tough industries, the cattle business as well as the dairy business. I guess they just couldn't get enough of work. But I got tickled. My grandmother never fully understood what I did. She could not understand why I would have worked so hard through school, gone to college, get a marketing degree, and then come back to the ranch and train horses. And then when I started doing clinics and started going to expos and doing presentations there, and then people would hire me to go and be a keynote speaker somewhere, my grandmother never fully understood what I would do. And every time I'd go visit her, she would always have the Sulphur Springs paper there. It was where our little town we were from. And she would slide it over to me and show me who was hiring. Well, such and such is hiring. Because in her mind, I guess I was jobless. Why would anybody go to college just to come back and work for yourself when you could have got an education and go to work for somebody and not have to work like that? So she never fully understood what I did. And she'd always ask me, so tell me again now, what do you do? And I'd finally just run out of ways to tell her. Well, no, hey, I talk for a living. I just tell people what they want to learn, and just try to help them out. I talk to make a living. Well, one day she tells me, well, thank God you get paid to talk, because Lord knows you do a lot of it. My grandmother had it figured out, didn't she?
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
Now, Emily, I'm going to end with this right here, with this story about my grandmother. My grandmother never once got to go see me at a clinic or an expo. She didn't even come over to the ranch much and watch me ride horses. She'd be out there from time to time watching us work cattle, but she didn't really get to watch what I did much on riding horses. We were on the way to Lubbock, Texas to do a keynote presentation out there. And my grandmother had been sick for a little while, not long, but been sick for a little while. And my wife was driving with me. And as soon as my phone rang, my heart just sank. I looked at my wife and I said, "That's Mama. She's going to tell me that Della Hay just passed away." My grandmother's name was actually Della Fay, but as a kid, I couldn't say Della Fay. I just said Della Hay. So I said, that's Mama calling to tell me that Della Hay just died. And sure enough, I looked at my phone, and sure enough, it was my mama calling. I answered the phone. "Mama, man, I just want to tell you that your grandmother just passed." And of course, my wife was patting me on the arm and just consoling me best she knew how to. When I'm upset, I tend to get pretty quiet. And we drove the rest of the way to Lubbock, and I didn't say much. We get there, and of course, they're wanting to know, "Well, Van, what are you going to talk about tonight?" And I was worrying them sick because I said, "I don't know." "What do you mean you don't know?" They didn't want me to just get up there and wing it, but I honestly did not know what I was going to talk about at that point in time. I had kind of gone a little bit mind numb. Mm-hmm. And I stepped up to the podium, and I wish I could say I was that smart, but I just opened my mouth and God put all the words in there and they just spilled out of me. And I closed that day with a gratitude to both those people and to God, because that was the first time my grandmother had ever heard me speak.
Oh.
And that event meant a lot to me, because I finally knew that my grandmama finally knew what her grandson did for a living. And it's just weird how we're always presented with such great opportunities such as that. Mm-hmm. I wasn't good enough to explain to my grandmother what I did until that day. Yeah. Didn't have to do much explaining. She could watch and see for herself, couldn't she? Yeah. Yeah. So that's what I cherish the most about our industry, is our industry puts us in a situation where we're constant students, we're constant ambassadors, and we meet some of the absolute most wonderful people working with one of the best animals I think that we could ever work with. And I'm sure dog and cat people say the same thing, but horses, just like my book says, sure gives us an opportunity to learn a lot, because the horse in my life has always been my teacher. Mm-hmm. Maybe because I was too hard-headed to learn it from the people, but I would learn it from the horses, and the horses would set up situations for me that I would better understand it. Mm-hmm. And had it not been for the horse, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do all that I've done in my life and in my career. So I'm so grateful. And grateful for the folks like yourself too, for continuing to let this thing happen for folks like myself. Thank you, Miss Emily. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for taking the time. I really enjoyed getting to visit with you, and I hope we have the opportunity to chat about something else in the future.
Anytime. I love it. I love the industry. Anything I can do to help represent it, I'll do everything in my power.
Well, fantastic. Well, you have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Miss Emily. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Van.